Hello, hello there, friends and family. How are you doing? And welcome back to another session of Let's Harp About It, right here with your host, Winnie O. Yes, we're going to talk about all things rethinking law enforcement and with particularly traffic law enforcement today. And so I have a very special guest. He'll be joining us right here, real quick, shortly with us. But take a quick second, share, let your friends know, let your frenemies know to join the conversation, right? And if you happen to miss it while we're live, do catch up on demand whenever you can across our social media platforms. That's on Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, as well as Twitter at harpnow.org. That's at HARPNOWORG. Now, let's get right into it, okay? Listen, it'd be like that. So first, I wanted to take a moment to remind us what do we really mean when we talk about traffic law enforcement, right? It's the way that police typically interacts with, whether it's pedestrians or vehicle users or other, motorists or anybody who happens to be interacting on the streets, in terms of traffic policies and enforcement of traffic laws. And so oftentimes that word intersectionality does actually play a role in how folks use these spaces, how folks maneuver on these spaces. I know one of the terms that that has been pretty much now normalized in the conversations about transit safety or mobility and transit safety is arrested mobility, right? Understanding how at times black and brown bodies, but black and brown people, you know, get treated or may experience law enforcement differently while maneuvering through traffic environments. And so even something as simple as walking from one place to another, right? We've seen certain law enforcement also kind of overreach when it comes to jaywalking policies, right? And it also overlapping that with stop and frisk, right? When law enforcement policies are used in tandem with other enforcement policies in the name of public safety, right? Using traffic law enforcement to, you know, to reduce, let's say, drunk driving or other robberies, or trying to connect those with other things. We've seen kind of like that trend. And so it's at that point where we do really need to have more intentional head-on conversations about, is this approach to public safety, right, really the best way to do it? And so even as I mentioned, if we're talking, whether we're talking about jaywalking or drunk driving prevention, or and just a minor infringement, do we really need armed law enforcement for that? And so today, we have, as I mentioned, we have a special guest. Ken is going to be joining us here shortly to kind of, tell us more about more on the technical side of things, as well as policy and some of the amazing research work that he's been doing for years, that is finally coming into light and really gaining the contextual, appreciation, even beyond our technical spheres, which is hopefully the aim of what we do, right? Get our work, get the research that's being done out there so that folks are empowered to make better decisions, to make more informed decisions and policies. Politicians out there, if you're watching, you're welcome. So Ken, come on through. Welcome. How are you doing
Hi,
today?
good afternoon. Good.
Good
Nice to see
afternoon.
you.
Nice to see you. For those who do not know you, who are unfamiliar with you, if you don't mind, please introduce yourself, and then we can, get into, I guess,
Sure.
more of the work that you do in the context of traffic law enforcement.
Great. So, my name is Ken Barone, and I am the Associate Director of a public policy institute here in the state of Connecticut called the Institute for Municipal and Regional Policy at the University of Connecticut. And for the last 20 plus years, our institute has largely been focused on criminal justice related policy reforms here in the state of Connecticut. We are a nonpartisan public policy institute. We have largely been funded by the Connecticut General Assembly, and we were created to help the state of Connecticut think through complex policy issues. And as it relates to the topic that you're talking about today, um, I've been with the Institute over a decade now. And when I first started, there was a town in the state of Connecticut called East Haven, Connecticut. It was right outside of the city of New Haven, Connecticut. And there had been a number of police officers who were arrested by the federal government, the FBI, for racially profiling and violating the civil rights of members of the Latinx community. And so, as you can imagine, there was a bit of a political firestorm in the wake of those arrests and the federal government coming in and suing the municipality. And ultimately, there was a consent decree between the Department of Justice and this police department to reform the agency. And state policymakers, and we had a fairly new governor at the time, were looking at each other going, how did it get to this point? How is it that the feds came in and needed to deal with this, right? Why weren't we on top of it? Because in Connecticut, back in 1999, we had passed a law banning racial profiling, which was about the time when we started to see these things happen across the country. And we had also built a law to require police to report information on who they pull over in traffic stops so that that data could be studied so that we could make sure that police weren't profiling. Now, there's a couple questions that people might be asking themselves, like, why traffic stops? Why do we care? Right?
Right.
Traffic
Yeah.
stops are the most common encounter between law enforcement and the general public. So researchers 25 plus years ago, when the country first started really having a more serious conversation about racial profiling, said, we should really be collecting and looking at data on traffic stops because, that's a good window into everyday interactions that law enforcement have with the public. And in Connecticut, we had done that. We had passed a law in 1999. We began to collect some data as a state, not our institute. And ultimately, the state produced a study back in the early 2000s that said, unsurprisingly, I think to some, nothing to see here, everything's good. Well, you can imagine when the study was done largely by what in Connecticut we call the chief state's attorney's office. So this was the chief prosecutors in the state. There was a lot of people that I think were skeptical of the results of that study, and so the legislature at the time said, well, I think we maybe need to keep doing some work, and so they moved the entity that was responsible for collecting and conducting these studies to what at the time in Connecticut we had was called the African American Affairs Commission. And they said, okay, you're going to be responsible for this law moving forward. Well, what the state didn't do is they didn't put any resources behind this. And so
that's what happens.
No money, and police were collecting traffic stop data on paper forms. And once a year, they put them in a big banker's box and they mailed them to this state agency that had just a few people working for it. And they said, good luck, make something useful of this. So you can imagine if you're sitting in an office with 500,000 pieces of paper, it's not all that useful to you. So now fast forward to 2011, we have the incident in East Haven and the legislature saying, well, we have this law and we collect this data. What's going on? Well, and the state agency looked and said, nobody's even sending us this data anymore. We can't do anything with it. You didn't give us any money to actually help us set this system up properly. And what am I supposed to do with 500,000 pieces of paper every year? Right. And so,
pause, if you don't mind. Could you provide some additional context on the incident in East Haven for those who may be unfamiliar?
Sure. So as police officers were accused of and ultimately convicted of harassing members of it was primarily the Latinx community. So through traffic enforcement, through harassing business owners in areas where they believed there were higher numbers of illegal immigrants. And actually it took a white Catholic priest to really take up the cause for the Latinx community who was largely afraid, I think, to pursue the harassment that was occurring on the part of the police department and
Mhm.
to go to the federal government. And ultimately, Yale was right in their backyard. And so they bought in
Mhm.
the community through the organization of this Father Manship had bought in researchers from Yale and I believe the Yale Law School Clinic and
Wow.
said, there's a real problem, right? They're planting
Yeah.
things on individuals. There was video evidence of falsifying reports and falsifying arrests and a number of police officers in the wake of getting the attention of the Department of Justice and the Department of Justice in Connecticut doing a full investigation. They arrested officers who were involved in these activities. I believe four of the officers ended up being convicted and incarcerated for a period of time. But the
Mhm.
big reform came when the feds basically came in and took over the agency, right? They drove out the chief who had created that culture. And
Yeah.
so, there were significant reforms that took place at the department level, but what it really sparked in Connecticut was a conversation about racial profiling. And what it really brought to the forefront was how this law was defunct. And that's when, at the time, we had a fairly new governor, Governor Malloy, who his administration had reached out to us. We were at a public college and said, we're in a fiscal crisis. We don't have the resources to figure out how to solve this. Can you help? Can you step in and help us rewrite the law? And so we entered that space largely because we had been doing work on other criminal justice reforms as an institute. We were focused on primarily prison reform, cutting the incarceration. We came at it from Connecticut was one of 5 states at the time that was spending more money on incarceration than it was on higher education. And so, we were approaching it from we need to find a way to reduce incarceration so that there's more money, right, in the state budget to go for things that are important. So that's how we came to the work. That's how we were approached to do this.
And you touched on several points that I will kind of bring us back into shortly here, but even the idea of the financial incentive in reducing or eliminating this racial profiling, this racial bias, right? Understanding that there is a financial cost to this kind of behavior, right? Being perpetuated where one is spending more in incarceration or these behaviors than even in education. And that goes back to show what are we prioritizing as cities, as boroughs, as communities across the board.
Yeah, I mean, and all you have to do to understand any government's priorities is look at how they spend their money. I mean,
Mm.
when your Department of Corrections is one of the largest line items in your state budget, that tells you something about the priorities of the state. Now, we are
Mm.
proud in Connecticut in that in the last
Mhm.
decade, as a result of really focused reforms that have occurred, we have cut our prison population in half. We are one of the first states to cut 50.
Mhm.
And so in 2008, we had almost 20,000 residents incarcerated in the state of Connecticut. And last year, that number fell below 9,000 statewide. We've closed 3 prisons with another one slated to be closed here in Connecticut. And the fascinating thing, we're a little off topic, but the fascinating thing is that crime has also dramatically decreased. So, right, all this rhetoric around, crime will spike as a result of
Thank you.
no, no, crime is at a relatively historical. Now, there's been a bit of a pandemic impact, but that's as a result of the
Yes.
pandemic. But even with the pandemic impact, crime is still significantly lower than it was, um, um, 20 years ago.
This is so important because Connecticut is showing that it is possible to reduce the trend in terms of of unnecessary incarceration, right? And still maintaining order. Because we're hearing this even here locally in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where there's this perception of more police with safer neighborhoods. And it doesn't necessarily it's not a causality or like a
No,
cause
the
and effect
question
thing.
I always ask folks when they talk about more policing, and we'll talk about it in a minute with regards to
Yeah.
traffic safety, because that's a
Yes,
big piece of my research. But what are we
absolutely.
talking about? Let's take a town, an average
Mm,
size suburban or even urban community. Let's take a
mhm,
city. I'll take the city of Hartford, which is right in my
mhm,
backyard.
mhm,
Let's take an average patrol. Let's say the mid shift. How many officers are patrolling the street? Okay, it's a 400 person agency. Maybe you have 6 or 7 districts. Maybe you have 3 people per district. Let's just say you have 30 to 40 officers patrolling during any given shift. Let's even
mhm,
make it 50, right?
mhm.
Now, this is a city of almost 100,000 people. Okay, so
Oh,
what are you realistically going to be able to increase your police presence to? 100 cops? Right, so you double your budget, you got 100 cops,
mhm.
and we tend to go to law enforcement as the solution to certain problems, thinking, oh, if we beef up enforcement, right,
Yes,
that will
yes.
somehow reduce. Police are largely reactive.
Thanks,
So
that
it's
part
not to
listen.
say not to say that increased enforcement in a particular
Mhm,
area for, say, a rise in homicides for a certain period of
mhm.
time can have an impact. But this
Correct.
idea that somehow, a significant increase of enforcement, to resolve the vast majority of crimes, which are mostly property crimes, right? It's
Yes.
just, instead, it's not about, I've always found it's not necessarily about increased enforcement, it's about more effective enforcement.
No,
It's
thank
about
you.
it's about using data to help you understand how and what
Correct.
role enforcement can play, and then measuring how effective it is. And
Absolutely.
largely, police are getting better at doing that, but they're still not
Mhm,
great at doing that. And that's where sort of
mhm.
we come
Absolutely. Uh,
in the traffic safety world in particular, because there's often been a large sort of thinking, one of the ways we make our roadways safer for drivers is we
mhm.
increase enforcement. And
Yes.
that isn't
Yes.
necessarily true, right? I
Mhm,
mean, enforcement certainly plays a role in
mhm,
reducing fatalities, reducing injuries, and reducing accidents, but police can't be everywhere all the time. And so I always
mhm.
say we oftentimes, as a society, because it's easy, go to the wrong E. We go to
Mhm,
enforcement instead of engineering.
mhm.
So if we see a
Ooh,
rise in motor vehicle accidents, say at a certain red light, well, sure, you could place a cop there, but the cop's not going to be there 24 hours a day, 7 days a week for 365 days. So let's bring the engineers in to figure out, maybe we should replace the light with a rotary. Maybe we should change the timing of the light. Maybe we should narrow the road. Maybe, right? There's lots of civil engineering strategies that we often don't employ because
okay.
enforcement's easier. And we know, well, people will feel better if we put a cop at the corner and we do it for a week and then they'll leave us alone. Well, bring the engineers in. We can actually reduce fatalities, reduce injuries, and not waste long term resources on police presence in certain,
Mm,
say, high accident areas so that they can focus on other things.
that is a word right there in and of itself. That is a word on this Saturday morning. Oh, rather afternoon now. Um,
So I can,
yes.
so I know we went a little like
Yeah.
off topic, but to get back to Connecticut story, because I do want to just
Yes.
share a little bit more about what we've been able to do
Correct.
here. Um,
Absolutely.
so, when we were approached to try and help resolve or to try and wrap our arms around this issue here in Connecticut in the wake of the East Haven scandal, um, I'll be honest with you, we had been working in this space for a while, but not in the traffic safety space, not in the racial profiling space. So the first thing we did, which ended up being, I think, one of the key recipes to our success here, is we said, well, we can't go this alone. We can't just sit as a think tank in a room and figure out how to solve all the world's problems. We created an advisory board of stakeholders, and we said we just have to bring everyone to the table, from advocacy organizations to state agencies to, right, the ACLU and the NAACP and the local police and the state police, and we have to put everyone at a table. And we have to, instead of telling people what the solution is, we have to be the facilitators between these stakeholders to figure out how do we reform our laws so that it can be more effective moving forward. And so we ended up creating a 26-member advisory board, which would seem like a lot of folks to wrangle, but it was necessary. And they all came together. and they reformed the state's racial profiling law. They presented reforms to the legislature that year, and the legislature almost unanimously, I think there was one or two votes against, but it was, we'll call it virtually unanimously, adopted all the reforms to the racial profile law. Now you might be saying, well, what reforms did they adopt? Well, the first thing we knew we had to do is we had to modernize our system. We couldn't keep having police collecting and reporting data on paper. That doesn't help anybody. So we had to build a system where police could collect and report data in virtually real time, and then build a system so that we could evaluate that data on a regular basis so that we could identify problems before they become East Haven, right? And the goal of our system, the goal of our work, rather, which the advisory board really worked to sort of, they set a mission, right? And the mission is on our website, ctrp3.org, stands for Connecticut Racial Profiling Prohibition Project. And the mission was to eliminate racial profiling, but it was also to build a system that builds trust between law enforcement and the communities that they serve. And so that's a tall task, right? So we passed the law, and the legislature said at that point, okay, you have a year now to implement this law. So it just so happened, little detour about how this work gets funded. The state of Connecticut, when all of this was going down, was literally in the process of giving back $1.2 million to the federal government, which they had secured under the Bush administration to fund this work. So in 2006, this is a crazy story. I know we're all looking like a little perplexed, right? In 2006, the Congress and the Bush administration had agreed to a transportation funding bill. We just passed infrastructure recently, right? Congress does infrastructure bills about every 5 years. And in that infrastructure bill, Congress gave money to states and said, hey, we want to incentivize states to start collecting data on drivers, and in particular, the race of drivers. And we want you to write laws that ban racial profiling, and then that study whether or not it's occurring. So Connecticut had a law in the books in 99. We were collecting data on drivers. And so we qualified for seed money to build out this new system. Well, 2006 to 2011, when we got involved, nobody in the state, the money went to the Department of Transportation, which is because it was an infrastructure bill, kind of, right? People don't think infrastructure in this space. And the state was sitting on it. Nobody had secured the funds. And so we got a call when we started the work saying, hey, we're actually getting ready to give this money back because we never spent it. The feds will let us spend it if you guys will come in and secure it. And we thought, wow, that's helpful. So our work was, all this initial work was largely funded by this old money that the state had been sitting on, getting ready to give back to the feds. And what we did with it was we built a system where even today we collect 26 data points on every driver stopped by police in an electronic format. And the data is submitted to us in almost real time, right? So police out there making traffic stops right now or collecting data right in the computers in their cars. And that data is coming back to a centralized state repository. So the first hurdle was move past paper. Build this. Now we have 107 police departments in Connecticut, over 9,000 police officers. So it wasn't a small thing to create an electronic system across 100 plus police departments. And so that everybody was collecting the same data in the same way, was our first task. And then the second task was, okay, you've got all this data. Now what do you do with it? Do you just, right? And what we noticed was that there were about 25 states across the country when we started this work that had laws on the books similar to Connecticut, and were doing this. They were collecting data on drivers. And so we said, well, maybe we don't have to reinvent the wheel. What are other states doing? We'll see what they're doing, and then we'll replicate them. And so
Mhm.
what we saw was that most states were doing one of two things with the data. They were either
Mhm.
taking it and summarizing it and just putting it out there, saying, "Well, you guys make what you want of it." They would say, "Well, 10% of the drivers stopped in this particular town were black, were Hispanic, were Asian
Mhm.
Pacific Islander. What does it mean? Whatever." They didn't make that
Mm.
assessments.
Yes.
Or they would have researchers come in every few years and typically sort of compare who was stopped to some sort of a census benchmark. So, 5% of the drivers stopped in town A were black, but only 1% of the population was black. And so there must be a problem, right? That would be kind of the nature of the assessment. In both of those scenarios, the same thing occurred. And that is that um, members of the public would and advocacy groups would come out and say, well, this data is bad. Police are profiling. Look at these disparities. This is a problem. And the police would come out and they say, well, you don't understand, right? It's complicated.
Mhm.
We've got a mall in our town, or I've got a big community college, or I've got a sports arena, and it brings people to my town from everywhere. And so rather than data being used to bring people together and to build trust, which was our mission between law enforcement and the communities they serve, the data was
Mhm.
largely being used by both entities to undermine that trust, right? And instead of people coming together, they just were in their corners, right? Sort of pointing the finger, saying, um, you're wrong, no, you're wrong. And we thought, well, we don't want to do all this work and then just further the divide, right? That
Mhm.
doesn't seem helpful to us. So we
Mhm.
set out on a mission. We said, well, we're going to find a better way to analyze this data. We're going to find that
Mm.
one scientific method that will tell us for sure if police are profiling, right? And we brought researchers from all over. And what we quickly realized is that doesn't exist, right?
It's yeah.
There was no perfect scientific tool to tell us if, certainly not that everybody would agree on, right? Because our
Yes.
stakeholders were still shaping how we do this. And so
Correct.
a light bulb went off one day for our project team, and we said, well, hang on a minute, maybe we're approaching this all wrong. Maybe it's
Mm.
not about finding that one tool that will tell us for sure if police are profiling. There's lots of really good methods out there, and maybe we should be using all of them. And so what we ultimately ended up with was 7 tests that vary in terms of sort of their level of statistical rigor. And we thought, well, listen, I think that if you show up with a statistical disparity in one test, well, maybe the test is bad, et cetera, et cetera. But if you show up across multiple tests, regardless of how we look at you, we started calling it the preponderance of the evidence approach. If we keep
Mm.
identifying a disparity, regardless of how we slice and dice the data, then maybe there's a
Mhm.
problem there, right?
Oh, that
And
part.
right. And so that's ultimately the approach we adopted. And so that's one thing we were doing differently from other states. And then the second, which I think is the most important thing that we started doing differently from other states, is we also felt like we had an obligation to do more than just produce an annual study that pointed the finger at police departments. Right. So again, when researchers came into other states, they usually would identify disparities and then say, well, good luck figuring it out. You guys have a problem. We'll see you again when we get hired to do this again. And we thought we have an obligation to try and figure out what's driving these disparities and how do we get police to eliminate those disparities. And
Correct.
so we don't simply produce an annual report that identifies departments that have racial and ethnic disparities, but we then work with those departments and communities to drill down on the data to figure out what is driving those disparities and how can police, what interventions can police put in place to reform those disparities. Um, and um, and that to me was really the part of the process when we were able to start to bring together law enforcement and the communities they serve, because we would start to go in and say, hey, we identified some significant disparities, but let's talk about how you do police enforcement. Why do you do it this way in this neighborhood and this way in this neighborhood? What is your ultimate goal? What are you trying to achieve? Okay, are the techniques and I can give you a couple examples. What are the techniques you're trying to use? And let's
Yes.
see how they're achieving that. And so to date in 2021, we have produced 7 statewide studies. So we have analyzed data in Connecticut 7 times. We produce a study every year of 107 police departments. We identify those agencies that are have the most significant disparities based on all these tests, and then we go in and we work with those agencies. So we've produced 7 statewide studies. We've identified 30 of our 107 departments that warranted these interventions, and then we've gone into those 30 departments over the last 7 years to figure out what exactly is driving the disparity and then to implement reforms to change that. And we're proud to say that it's taken a long time. It's been a lot of hard work, but 10 years into this process and 7 years into data collection and analysis, just this past year, it was the second year in a row where the statewide disparities they haven't disappeared, but they are substantially lower than when we started this work. So disparities are starting to move in the right direction. They're declining, right? We're seeing more fair and equitable traffic enforcement. We still have a long way to go, but the point is it's trending in the right direction.
And based on perhaps the interactions that you may be having with the respective police departments, what is the sentiment around that? Like, is it being well received? Is there an acknowledgement of, oh, this is where we've come from, this is where we are, and this is where we're moving to? Like, what is
So
the, I guess?
it's been a long process. I won't lie.
Mhm.
When we started this work, I have to honestly say, police weren't thrilled, right? They didn't want to be having these conversations. They were uncomfortable. There was a lot of pushback. If you go back and sort of follow the media narrative when we started this work, you'll see the articles written about our first few reports where we would produce a report and then the Police Chiefs Association would hold a press conference and they would
Mm.
dispute the findings and we just kind of stayed focused. We said, that's noise. And we're going to, and what we would do is we would just get into the department and say, listen, we have to figure it out. You don't want to be on a list every year. You don't want to put your head in the sand. That won't be helpful to you. And we're here to listen, right? We're going to listen to you. We're happy to look at and understand your perspective. We're happy to look at more data. We're happy to do all of that. But we can't ignore the problem. And so where we are today is very different from where we started. And today, law enforcement in Connecticut are really receptive to the work we do because it took us time to prove to them that we were fair and that we were willing to go in and to listen to them and to, we wouldn't always agree, but that we were going to give them a fair shake and that we were going to try and meet them where they were at. And then our approach has been, we're just going to convince you with data, right? And so I'll give you a really good example. This is the one I always like to use because to me, it kind of tells the story of the power of data and also sort of light bulbs going off in police departments. We went into a police department a couple of years ago with significant disparities. And we're sitting around the table with the command staff and what I had said was, listen, what looks really different about your data from other departments is that you make more low-level equipment-related stops than any other town in the state of Connecticut. So you're out there largely stopping drivers for some sort of a defective lighting issue, a headlight out, a tail light out, and substantially more than the way other departments do that. So just to put it in context, typically less than 10% of a police department stops are for some sort of defective lighting issue. In this department, it was close to 40%. So it was like, that stood out to us. This was a
Mhm.
predominantly white suburban community, and they bordered a city in Connecticut, a more diverse environment. And this defective lighting enforcement was happening, you guessed it, closer to the border of the city, right? And the
Right.
department said to us, well, listen, as part of our roving DUI patrol, we send our cops out there during peak drinking hours, and the bars happen to be near the border of the other town. And so the driving population is more diverse. And we tell them, stop cars for any low level reason you can think of. Um, Ask the driver where you're coming from, where you're going to, have you had a drink tonight? If
Mhm.
they don't appear to be intoxicated, right, then you just say, hey, your brake light's out. You should get that fixed. Have a nice day. Okay. So, to us, that sounded logical, right? You could understand the enforcement strategy. So the
Mhm.
next question we asked was, all right, is it effective? Because at the end of the day, if you
Right.
can point to its success, then you can go back to your community. That's how we felt, and have a conversation with them and say, listen, we know that this strategy might be driving a disparity because of where we're doing it, but look at how many drunk drivers have got off the street and how safe the street is. And they said, well, yeah, we've been doing this a long time. Of course it's effective. Okay, well, how many drunk drivers did you get? I said, well, we don't really track that. All right, so we will. So we went and looked at all their data, and we pulled additional data. And out of 1,608 drivers stopped for a low-level defective lighting violation in that calendar year. Now, put that in perspective. They had only stopped 740 speeders in that same time frame, right? And so they stopped more than twice as many cars for a low-level lighting violation than they did for speeding, which we know is a leading cause of accidents, injuries, fatalities, deaths. And so we went back to the agency a few weeks later. I said, okay, we've looked at all your data. What does success look like? You tell me. I'm not the police chief. I'm not the police administrator. So of those 1,608 drivers stopped for low-level lighting violations, how many of them would have to be drunk in order for you to feel comfortable going back to your community saying, this is the strategy we're going to continue? And the chief said about 10%. Because I think we probably found 150 or so drunk drivers. Okay, so 150 drunk drivers, you're going to keep doing that all day long. Fine, that was your benchmark. I'm good with that. How many do you think you found? We went around the table and everybody thought, 120, 130, 150. Okay. Would you be surprised to know that a 1,608 driver stop for low-level lighting violations, you found, in fact, one drunk driver, right?
Mhm. I was like, I'll give him 10. I'm like, I'll say it.
And they didn't know. And in fact, they were much more likely to find a drunk driver when they stopped a speeder. Of the 740 speeding stops they made, they stopped 20 or so drunk drivers. And where they mostly found drunk drivers was a violation in our statute of crossing the double yellow line, right? Which,
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah.
so in that agency, it was going back saying, okay, let's help you devise a strategy to achieve what you're trying to achieve, which is a safe roadway, making sure people aren't drinking and driving. That's a laudable cause. And let's help you find the techniques that allow you to achieve that without driving a racial and ethnic disparity. And a year later, after they had implemented the new reforms, they had reduced their overall defective lighting enforcement by almost 70%. They had increased at the same time period their hazardous moving violation stops by almost 70%. And they had increased their overall rate of finding a drunk driver by 250%. So, and here's the real kicker. They eliminated their racial and ethnic disparities in their data. So, right, that's an example of we went in and we created a win-win-win, right?
Hmm.
Safer
Yeah.
roads, you could achieve what you wanted to, and there was no longer sort of this low level going into a higher Black and Hispanic area, stopping cars for low level reasons. Now, what we've learned in our research, I think there's just a few points that are really important. That's one example, and I've got 30 of them from all 30 departments we've worked in. And we've actually done this work in Rhode Island. And so we've done 4 studies in Rhode Island and looked at 12 agencies there. So I've got examples from 42 departments total. But we've learned really a few key things. When police use the motor vehicle laws
Hmm.
to focus on hazardous driving behaviors, those violations that cause accidents, following too closely, speeding, blowing a stop sign, running a red light, talking on your cell phone, right? Little to no racial disparities in the data, and safer roads. When police start to use the motor vehicle code as a crime reduction tool, racial disparities through the roof, and oftentimes what we would refer to as a very low return on investment. And that is so using the motor vehicle laws as a crime reduction tool, that's a vestige of the war on drugs, right?
Oh, thank you. I was gonna
Then,
say, are we using as it was intended or as these laws are
well,
intended to?
it's
Or
really interesting because what the what the war on drugs really taught police, and there were programs that the federal government ran in the 80s and 90s, for one called Operation Pipeline, and it was literally the federal government coming in and teaching local police agencies how to use a state's motor vehicle code to be able to interdict drug behavior. And the thing is, and what that really meant was use your motor vehicle laws to stop anybody that you think is suspicious and search their car. And so the motor vehicle codes in most states are written in such a way that it is impossible for any driver to get behind the wheel of their car and not have a technical violation of the motor vehicle code within 30 seconds of being on the roadway. And most
correct.
vehicles have some violation of the technical motor vehicle code before they even turn their car on. And the most common one in Connecticut is we have an obstruction of plate law. You can't obstruct your license plate. Now, that was written back when those tint covers were becoming popular, to put on plates so you couldn't see the plate. But
Correct.
the way it was technically written, if any part of the plate was obstructed, a police officer could stop you. So police started to interpret it to say, well, if you say a lot of people drive around and they advertise, say, the college they went to, right, with the frame around the
Yes.
plate, and that
Mm-hmm.
might block part of the word Connecticut up top, right? Now the numbers are visible. Police know what a Connecticut plate looks like, right? And so technically that's a violation of the law and they can
Mm-hmm.
stop you. And in fact, 20,000 people a year in Connecticut get stopped for a quote display of plate violation. And you can imagine who's more likely to be stopped for a display of plate
Mm-hmm.
violation than other types of stops. And but police were trained, right, to say, listen,
Yeah.
you can, and so you can,
Yeah.
you can get into any car you essentially want. And so
Yeah.
I always say, some of the intent of the laws might have been pure, right? But unfortunately, the application of some of these laws has shown that they're not being applied the way that they were intended, and they're not being applied fairly. And so I do think we put a lot of this on police to reform. And I've sort of become a proponent of saying we should really be going back to
Thank
legislature and
you.
saying, no,
Thank
you need to
you.
be. And so the state of Virginia, for example, has probably done this the best.
Mm-hmm.
After the murder of George Floyd, they passed a comprehensive reform of their motor vehicle laws, and they created what's called a primary and secondary traffic law system. So they
Mm-hmm.
basically took all those stops that had been historically used as part of the sort of war on drugs roving patrol, a
Mm-hmm.
headlight out, a tail light out, a display of plate violation, an administrative offense like your registration expired, right? They made them
Correct.
secondary offenses. And so what that means is that police can no longer stop you for a brake light out, one brake light, right? Or one tail
Mm-hmm.
light. No brake lights, that's a different story. But the
Mm-hmm.
idea was that police should be focusing on hazardous driving behavior. And if they pull
Correct.
a car over because they were doing 90 and a 50 and the car's unregistered, fine. It's a
Mm-hmm.
secondary violation, you can deal with it then. But that shouldn't be
Yes.
your sole motivation for stopping conducting motor vehicle enforcement. And in the state of Connecticut, we're one of only a few states that, again, in the wake of the murder of George Floyd,
Mm-hmm.
we removed law enforcement's ability to conduct consent searches. So we were finding
How
that
about that?
we
Yes.
were finding that police were 3 to 5 times more likely to ask a Black and Hispanic motorist to search their car.
That part.
Now, some people might say, well, I mean, if you have nothing to hide, why wouldn't you? First of all, uh, we know that there's a disparity because police aren't asking white people to search their vehicles, number one. And
Thank you.
number two, right, there's a very different um, um, uh, dynamic and relationship between law enforcement and black and brown communities than between law enforcement and white communities. And
Definitely.
so what we were not only were we finding that police were using the tool more in black and brown communities, but
Mhm.
consent searches had some of the lowest returns on investment. So what I mean is they
Mhm.
just didn't lead to good results, right? So
Mhm.
um, police in Connecticut would find contraband less than 15% of the time as a result of a
Mhm.
consent search. And most of the contraband they would find were like small amounts of marijuana or, right, we're not talking, major drug busts here. Not to say, right, listen, I've heard law enforcement before have some anecdotal story about the time they had a consent search and they found
Mhm.
marijuana. Sure, of course that
Yeah.
happens. But but police, when they search a car, when they build a good probable cause and search a car as
Mhm.
a result of probable cause, the success
Thank you.
rate jumps to almost 70%.
Oh,
So,
look at that.
you're saying that so in Connecticut, we've basically said in the last year now, no more consent searches. You can't ask to search a car anymore. You
I
build
support
probable
that.
cause, you want to build a good case, go ahead, search the vehicle, but you can't just because what you would see is you saw a pattern. You would see in black and brown communities, police doing more of this low level enforcement, stopping a car for a brake light or for an administrative offense or some equipment offense. They didn't really care about the offense. They would use that to ask the driver, hey, can I search your car? The driver
Mhm.
would say, sure. And that's how they would get into the vehicles. And so we had one community that said to us, well, that's a good crime reduction strategy. That's how we get guns and drugs off the street. Okay, fine. How successful are you? So we went in and looked, and what they ended up doing for us was the department said, we'll do something for you. For the next 6 months, I'm going to tell my officers they can't stop cars for any of these low level reasons. And they listed them out.
Mhm.
And they can't ask to search a car anymore. They have probable cause, they'll search a car, but that's it. And the chief said to me, he goes, but I'm willing to bet you crime is going to go up. And he goes, and we'll just point to you
That's
guys.
what we hear.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we'll say it's your fault. We said, great, let's just try it. We went back after those 6 months, and the chief said, I got to tell you, I'm shocked. He goes, uh, my crime rate is actually down 5%. My
Mm.
fatality, injury, accident rate is down 15% because police were focusing on the right types of violations. And
Thank
my
you.
racial disparity disappeared. Yeah, because your police started doing good police work. They weren't just out there saturating an area with lots of traffic stops.
And that really brings home the message in terms of, especially in, let's say, in police departments that do have the capacity need where you don't have, the ideal number of law enforcement. Instead of stretching your existing personnel thin, be effective in how you are approaching, public safety, traffic safety, like, instead of like sending them out there to do these frivolous stuff. So I'm like, use the data to make more well-informed decisions
It's
and
not
reduce
always about it's not
disparities.
always about right quantity, but that just goes like it's about quality, right? If you're making you
Absolutely.
know, um, thoughtful, if and if you use the tool the way it's intended. So traffic laws were intended to largely improve roadway safety. They weren't intended. It's not a great tool to try and reduce crime. What we
No.
know, what we
Hmm.
know from our research is that
Please say
police
that again. Please repeat that for the people who missed that. I don't want to interrupt you.
yeah, you try, when police use the tool of traffic enforcement the way it was really intended, which was to improve roadway safety, it's a good and effective tool. When they start to use it as a crime reduction strategy, it's not that effective and it drives disparities. And what does that do? It leads to an erosion of trust between law enforcement and the communities they serve. Because I'll tell you something, you know, which I don't, I think, people that live and experience police in that way, they know this already. Uh, but when you're stopped, and the police now will say, well, we don't give them tickets for those offenses. Yeah, but you know what? If I'm stopped, I've been stopped 3 times, I think, my whole life, right? I know people that have been stopped 3 times in 6 months, right, in these communities. So we experience policing very differently. And yeah, sure, in those communities, police might not in Connecticut be issuing a ticket. But if I'm stopped once a month, that gets really irritating. And I
Yes.
know that when the cops stopped me for a display of plate violation, they didn't care about that, right? That's not why they were
Right?
stopping me. They were stopping me because I looked suspicious. They wanted to talk to me. They wanted to look at my car. They wanted to see if it smelled right. A whole host. And at the end of the day, there's something fundamental that I think we have to remember. And that is that people have the right to freedom of movement.
Oh, that part.
Okay. And what we identified in Connecticut is that I think there's also a misnomer that racial profiling is something that's largely concentrated in our cities, right? It's the police in Connecticut, in Hartford, in New Haven, in Bridgeport. That's what's driving
Mhm,
this. And the truth is that of those
mhm,
30 agencies we've identified, the majority of them are white suburban communities that border
mm,
cities. And what's
mm,
happening? It's high police presence at the border of those communities, stopping cars for low level reasons that cross the border, right? And it's
yeah,
cloaked in a crime reduction. Well, listen, in the city of Hartford, there isn't a major grocery store. You know where the grocery store is? It's in the white suburban community next to the city of Hartford, right over the border. And guess what? People have to buy food. They have to
okay.
come. And when the
Mm,
police sit at the border and they stop,
mhm,
like, and we've had a conversation, and in some of these days, the police say, well, we have a bad shoplifting problem. Please tell me how stopping a car going to the grocery store solves a shoplifting problem.
mhm,
Now,
right.
if you place an
Mm,
officer in the store, say, that has the high degree of shoplifting, that's probably more effective than saturating an area. And so we actually did a
yeah,
heat map one time of traffic stops
mm,
around the city of Hartford because we had
mhm,
identified every single, at some point, suburban community around the city of Hartford. And the heat map was really telling visually because what you saw was that there was just intense enforcement by all these white suburban communities surrounding the city of Hartford. And I sort of half joke is, why don't we just put up a fence and some checkpoints? Because that's effectively what we've done, right? So why
yes,
don't we stop pretending like it's anything but that?
okay,
And so we've really been focused in Connecticut uh, on that's been, I think, the biggest issue for us to address, which is, and some of it is driven by the community, right? The police
mhm,
are largely being responsive to the community, and they'll say to us, well, that's what our community wants. Well, yeah, because there's a fear, right, in these white communities that it's the people from the quote cities are going to come in and terrorize us and create crime, and that's when you have to stop and say to the we've had this conversation many a times with law enforcement. Say, well, time out.
mhm,
People have
yeah,
the right to freedom of movement. They have the right
absolutely.
to come into your community to shop, to eat, to drive through
To
your
work,
community, to access a highway, to work, to right. And guess what? Guess what? The people from the suburban community do without being unduly harassed. They drive into the city all the time to work, to go
mm,
to entertainment venues, to go to.
like
So
that,
right, no, there's a clear freedom of movement for one group of people, and that is
yes,
less so for another group of people. And so that's been, I think, sort of the most illuminating thing for us and to address. And we've chipped away at that problem.
mhm,
Okay, it's not perfect because again,
mhm,
some of this is still being driven by the community, right? For example,
absolutely,
post pandemic, there's a rise in property crime, right? Shoplifting,
mhm,
larceny, and the communities now are outraged, and oftentimes without data or facts, the community puts pressure on the police department. Say it's got to be those people over there. They're the ones doing it. Go stop them. Make sure they don't come into our community and terrorize us. Uh,
okay.
so it's a challenge.
And I know we have to wind down here real quick, but I am so glad that you brought it full circle from your beginnings of this work and how even sometimes there are funds allocated to do just this, to address key problems from a policy, from an engineering standpoint, and those funds just go sitting. And even right now, with a lot of the federal um, uh, budgeting allocations now, we're now seeing this resurgence of, oh, we do need to do research on anti-racism or bias, or being able to collect contextual data that provides a clearer picture of how these policies are actually being implemented, again, specifically to transportation and and law enforcement practices and many other practices. Again, this issue of traffic law enforcement, I appreciate the fact that you also brought in the infliction of harm and what that looks like for different demographics, because that is one of those things that's oftentimes dismissed as irrelevant, right? And so when we look at not only how policing is done, understanding, well, what is effective, you know, implementation of these policies, and being able to ask, let's go back to the drawing board and understand, are we asking the right questions? Is the policy actually, correct, or do we need to rewrite it? Do
And
we
you
need to add
need the
clarification? So go ahead.
and you need the at the end of the day, what's fundamental to all this work is
Mm-hmm.
what we've tried to do is move the conversation away from anecdotes and to
Yes,
have it grounded in data so that we could say, okay, what are
absolutely.
you trying to measure? Great, let's look at it. Because
Mhm,
prior to this work being done here in Connecticut, the conversation
mhm.
was driven by anecdotes. It was police
Yes.
saying, well, we think this is what's happening and this way. And then you'd go and measure it, and it wasn't always true. And so, we would have cases where, in some cases, police would create self fulfilling prophecies.
Mhm,
So, we went into one department and they said, the reason why we stopped so many, in this case, brown drivers for driving unregistered vehicles is it's not a race thing; it's a socioeconomic thing, right? And so we said,
hmm.
well, time
That's a
out.
whole other
Where are you
conversation.
placing your license plate readers? Because if you're only placing them in the heavily Hispanic community and running
Mhm,
plates in that community, then exposure isn't the same. And in fact, what we found is that
mm,
when you exposed predominantly white communities in the whiter neighborhoods in that same community to the same type of enforcement, you found registration violations in this case at a 7% higher rate than in the Hispanic neighborhood. But right,
mm,
when it was based on anecdotes, it was, well, we know that poor people are more likely to not be able to pay their registration bill. And so our cops go in that neighborhood and they run plates to get unregistered cars off the street. Well, okay, I get how you got there, but
mhm,
it's not supported by fact. It's supported by anecdotal evidence. It's supported by profiling by proxy, which is sometimes what we
mhm,
call it, right? It's, well, listen, I'm not stopping you because you're Hispanic, but you're using a proxy, right, in a certain neighborhood. Um, and so that is why data is so fundamentally important. And one of the things that we've been trying to do here in Connecticut is to say to other states, hey, there's a model out there. It's not going to solve
yeah,
all your problems. Please, I don't want to oversell, but it is a place to start. It's a place to re-ground the conversation. There is no reason why in 2021, 50 states aren't collecting data in a centralized system in a thoughtful way, analyzing that data, working right.
mm,
It can be done. Um,
yes.
Now, priorities are different in different states.
Mhm,
The good news is that in the infrastructure bill signed just this past Monday by President Obama, that there's a little bit more money in that bill for states to be able to do this work. Not enough, right? But it's better than it was. Um, and so our goal is to see if we can go from four states have the Connecticut model. Connecticut, Rhode Island
mhm,
replicated our model. We went out and helped the state of California. They're implementing the same system out in California and Oregon. But we've got to get this system in more than just the East Coast and West Coast states.
mhm,
Because here's the deal, right? People leave their state, they leave their communities, they drive across the country, and the
yeah.
standard of policing varies wildly.
Drastically. Absolutely. Absolutely. All right, so I gotta sign us off, but once again, thank you so much for joining us today. We touched on so many things that I hope we'll be able to unpack on hopefully in a future session. So if you have any comments out there, for those of you who are watching, if you have any comments or questions, I have posted the website link on in the chat section. So please feel free to reach out to Ken. Yeah, so hopefully we'll catch you on the next Lunch and Learn. Ken, do you have any final remarks?
No, thanks for having me. It was great. Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Have a good weekend, everybody.